Today we're going to be talking about all things antique and why yours might not be turning out the way that you want it to. That's coming up. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Reeks. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today we're going to be taking a look at antique. And when I first got into leathercraft, the idea of smearing what looked like shoe polish onto all that hard work I had just finished was nerve-wracking to say the least. What if I don't do it right? What if I put too much on there? What if I leave it on there too long and I can't get it off? Basically, it boiled down to, what if I ruin my project? Well, the good news is, it's really not that scary. Today, we're going to take a look at all the important questions. How, what, when, where, and why? Probably not in that order. In fact, let's start with why. Well, there's two basic reasons. Number one is to accentuate a design, let's say a border design, like what we saw in Chuck's recent video where he did the side sewn scabbard. The other reason would be to add depth to the project. A lot of times we see this in floral. The most recent example for me would be the fantasy map that we released a couple of weeks ago. So now let's talk about the what. What do you use to antique? Well, there's lots of options on the market. There's all kinds of gels, water-based antiques, that type thing. My favorite is going to be the Fiebing's Antique Paste. And the reason I like it so much is it boils down to the consistency. Because it's so thick, it's very easy to paint it into very small areas, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second. So it's easy to paint it into small areas, and two, you really don't have to worry about it running anywhere unless you thin it down, so it stays where you put it. So now let's talk about the when. And to decide when to antique, you're going to have to answer a few questions on each individual project. For example, do you want the antique to actually color and tint the leather, or do you want the antique just to settle into the low spots? If you want it to add color to the leather, then we're going to antique before we seal it. If we want it to just settle into the recessed areas, then what we're going to do is we're going to seal it first. That will act as a resist, and the antique's really only going to settle in those low spots, which is going to give us the depth that we're looking for in our tooling. So the next question is, are you going to be painting the project? If you're not, we'll just jump back to the previous question and work through that. If you are painting the project, then what we're going to do, this is my sequence for it, okay? And it's important you go in the right order. Number one, I'm going to be painting it first. Then I'm going to seal it with an aerosol sealer. We use aerosol because a lot of times the liquid sealers that you rub on, they can lift paint off the project. So paint it, seal it with an aerosol sealer. Then I'm going to go back in and I'm going to freshen up the paint. And what I mean by that, let's say you've got a white area on there. The antique is going to dull it down. I'm going to go back in and more or less paint the center of it. I'm going to stay away from the antique on the edges. And then I'm going to seal it again with the aerosol. So paint it, seal it with an aerosol painter, seal it with an aerosol sealer. Then we're going to go back in, we're going to freshen up the paint, and then we're going to seal it again with the same aerosol sealer. So now I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball. What if it's a layered paint job versus a flat paint job? So let's define those real quick. A flat paint job is simply where you take a solid color and paint it onto the leather and let it dry. A layered paint job would be where we're building up different color variations over time. We saw it in the recent earring keychain video we did with the sunflowers. So if we're talking about flat paint, we would go through the order that we just talked about. But if it's a layered paint job, we're going to do it slightly different. And here's why. A layered paint job is very difficult to brighten up and touch up because there's different shades and variants of the color in there. You can't just go back in and touch it up really quick. So in that scenario, what we want to do is we want to seal the leather, then we're going to antique it. We're going to let it dry really good, probably 24 hours, and then we're going to go back in and we're going to paint our layered paint job in there, making sure to stay away from the antique. And what this does is it ensures that that antique is not going to mute and dull the paint job, and it doesn't require us to go back in there and freshen it up, which is virtually impossible to do on a layered paint job. So why would you want to paint then antique if the antique's just going to dirty and mute the colors that you just put down? Well, the truth is when you're putting paint down, it can be really difficult to get crisp edges. And what the antique does for us, it creates a buffer. It hides those imperfections in our paint job, and it allows us to move through it much, much quicker. The trade-off is that you're going to have to go back in and freshen up those colors because, like I said, it does dirty up and mute those colors. But like I said, the trade-off is it's faster and it's less stressful. So it's definitely worth it, in my opinion, if it's a flat paint job, to paint then antique versus trying to do it the other way around and get those really crisp edges, which can be very difficult to do. Really quick, before we go any further, if you're enjoying the video, if you're finding it helpful, do us a favor and click that like button. Tells me, tells Weaver, tells YouTube that we're on the right track. Now let's jump back in. Let's talk about where you should use the antique. We already talked about this a little bit, so we're not going to go too far into it, but essentially you want to use antique anywhere that you want to accentuate a pattern or create depth within the tooling pattern. Now, most of the time you're going to want to add it to the whole project, but there are times when you want to add it to specific areas, which is exactly what I did with this map right here. So we're going to jump over to that real quick. I really just wanted to accentuate the shoreline and the areas that the pirate would have touched it with his dirty hands. So that's what I did. I painted it into the areas right around the shoreline. I used a Q-tip to remove it from the land mass, so I made sure that I didn't get it up on the land. And I went in with a sponge and added it to the areas where I thought he was most likely to touch it with his hands, which is obviously where it would be the dirtiest and be the most worn. So now let's talk about the how. How are we going to go about the process of antiquing the project? Well, there's a few questions we've got to ask before we jump into that. The first question to ask is, do you want the antique to actually color and tint the leather, or do you just want it to add depth and accentuate the pattern? So if you don't want the antique to actually color the leather, then what we're going to do is we're going to start by sealing it before we antique it, and that's going to act as a resist. But one of the questions that we have to ask here is the leather painted? Because if the leather's painted, we don't want to add the tan coat style, Resolene style sealer, because as you put it on there, it can lift a lot of that paint off. So for me, what I do is I like to use the aerosol sealers. And for me, my number one choice is Leather Sheen. It has a waxy base to it, which acts as a water resistant barrier, which means it really locks the paint in better, and you don't have to actually touch the project as you're applying the sealer. On the other hand, if the project's not painted, then I'm going to be using Tan Coat. Now you can use Resolene or some of the other sealers if you want to. Neat Lack's out there as well, but my choice is going to be Tan Coat because I don't get as many streaks in the sealing process as I do with some of the other ones. Now you just want to let the sealer dry, and the way you can tell whether or not if it's dry and ready to apply the antique is whether or not it's still tacky. If it's still tacky, I like to use the back of my hand. If it's still tacky, then that means if you apply the antique now, the antique is literally going to stick to it and cloud your entire project. So you want to let it sit long enough to make sure that the sealer has dried and it's not tacky anymore. Once you are ready to add the antique, you can either add it to the entire project or you can paint it into specific areas. The easiest way to do this is if you're adding it to the entire project, a sponge works well. You can use a soft paintbrush. If you're painting it into specific areas, the easiest way to do that is going to be just to paint it in with an actual paintbrush. If you get it into areas that you don't want it to be in, the easiest way to remove it is just grab a Q-tip and lift it off really quick. Now we're going to let it sit for anywhere between 5 minutes up to 45 minutes. Just know the longer you let the antique sit on the actual project, the more it's going to stick to the project. Now this one, I let it sit for roughly 15 minutes, maybe just a fuzz longer, and then I used a paper towel to wipe it off. I like using a paper towel because it doesn't get down in all the cracks and lift that antique out of the areas that you want it to stay in. Just fold your paper towel nice and flat and wipe it off. You can also do the same thing with an old t-shirt or whatever you have laying around. Just make sure that it doesn't have any kind of tooth or grain to it because that'll leave patterns, and you don't want it to be a real long nap because that'll lift it out of the cracks. Once I've buffed the majority of the antique off the project, I'm going to sit this down and let it rest for about 15 to 20 minutes. That gives the antique that is there a better chance to adhere to the leather. Then I'm going to go back in with Tan Coat, probably another flat paper towel, just a little bit of Tan Coat. It doesn't take much, and I'm going to wipe it over the top of it again, very lightly, very gently buff the top of the project. And what this is going to do is it's going to lift off any of that residue that's muting and dulling down the project. Essentially, it's going to brighten it back up. Now, I know that was a lot of information, so let's recap it real quick. If it's a flat color, you can antique after you paint. If you're building up layers, you want to antique first, let it dry for 24 hours, then you can go back in and paint and build your layers up slowly, then seal it, probably with an aerosol sealer in both cases. Now here's your bonus tip. What if you want to make custom colors to antique with? Well, it's actually pretty simple. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the Fiebing's Neutral Antique and we're going to mix it with either paint or dye. But how do we do that? What's the correct ratio? Well, the best way that I've found to mix anything, whether it's antique and paint, two colors of paint, paint and water, simply put the two different mediums next to each other and then we're going to slowly stir them together. This is going to allow you to get the right saturation and consistency. Then you just apply it like any other antique. That's going to be it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. In the meantime, go make something amazing.